Hi everyone, it's Denise and welcome back to Dobby Books. Today is Wednesday, so it's What Am I Reading Wednesday, and I want to make sure that I briefly cover what I'm still going through. The one book I did finish was 69 AD, The Year of the Four Emperors. Um, Now, I did enjoy that read, and I got more details on how each one of the emperors came to power in that 1 year in Rome. But I do have to say, and this is just me, when a book um, it includes a lot of details about strategy and battle, that kind of loses my full attention. So I found myself in those areas kind of skimming over it and just getting to parts that um, caught my interest. But I did read a more of a portion of the book than not. And I would say it is a very good read if you're someone who's not really into battle plans and all that stuff. You might find it a little, I don't know, a little less interesting, but overall, it was a very good read. And I read it because I'm participating in Robert Robert G. Reader of Books in the Roman Emperor series. And so that was book number 1, 2, 3, 4. I think book number 5. I'm not sure what we're going to read after this. I'm looking forward to um, when Bob goes back, does another video, and we can find out what the next book is after that. So the next book that I finished, one book that I have to finish tonight because I borrowed it from the library and it's an ebook, and it's The Bookshop, which is the history of bookstores in America, and it's by Evan Friss. I wanted to make sure I got that right. Great book, wonderful book. He covers from the beginning, let's say Ben Franklin having his own bookstore. He moves his way forward through history. He eventually talks about, and I wish I could have this in front of me. He eventually talks about, let me do that. Hold on. Okay. After Ben Franklin, he goes into something called the Old Corner. He's now in Massachusetts. He moves to Parnassus on wheels, and I'm trying to remember where that came from. But how some rural areas and even some small towns did not yet have a bookstore, let alone a library. And he names names and locations, and he talks about how some people just simply loaded up some books in their little truck or the back of their car, and then they would sell books like this to certain individuals. I mean, whoever was interested. Marshall Field and Company is another bookstore that he talks about. And then, of course, there's the Gotham Book Mart, which is crazy popular. And I believe in that documentary that I mentioned to you in my last video, where I told you that the documentary was called Hello Bookstore. The man who owns that bookstore used to work in the Gotham bookstore. And the woman who owned that store was just famous. She had her hand on the pulse of book publishing, names, etc. And many publishers, people who had interest in the book industry would go to her. She really was wonderful she just had that connection. And this gentleman who was in the documentary that I mentioned used to work for her. And then there's the Aryan bookstore. Now, this was interesting because this is not something I realized, that there were a lot of Aryan, white nationalist kind of bookstores in Los Angeles and in other major cities across the United States that were very pro-Hitler and very anti-Semitic, and they were very out in the open about this. And it was very interesting how they made their propaganda very accessible. Number one, you could walk into the store. They had pamphlets there, booklets there, books there. They had, let's say it was the owner of that particular store plus volunteers or employees. They would talk with you. They would answer your questions. It was a place that you could go for meetings. It had all those characteristics of those unique bookstores that we've had in our history, but it promoted the propaganda of fascism, anti-Semitism, white nationalism. And it just struck me that this was something that was just out in the open. And of course, after, I believe it was after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, is when the FBI moved in, or the CIA, and they confiscated all the materials, and they arrested the owners of these Aryan bookstores. I just never knew that this was around, in my neighborhood. Then he goes in and he talks about Drum and Spear, which was a Black bookstore, and it catered to the Black population in the late 60s, early 70s, and how it really unified and strengthened the Black community, helped shape a sense of identity and purpose. And it was more of a continuation of what Dr. Martin Luther King had started. So this was after his assassination. And when they mentioned, how much, I think it was, I could be wrong, that the Black population was 13% of the US population. I could be wrong on that, but that there was only a certain percentage, a single digit percentage, close to zero, of actual bookstores that addressed the Black community. And these bookstores were there to help. And it talked about, like in all the other chapters, the owners, what they were about, how they ran that store, how they connected with the community, what they did, what the community's response to them. It reminds me a lot of here in California. There are bookstores in LA, so it's an hour or so away from me, that cater specifically to the Latin American community. And I can go in there myself, of course, and I can read books in Spanish. There are books in Spanish and in English. But this is a bookstore that's specific to the Latin American community. And I can see how that is just so crucial. Just a real, I'm trying to think of the word, that this is a spot where they can get the information they need, the support that they need, the education that they need. It was just fantastic. I thought that was great. Now, many of these have already gone out of business, and not just like the Aryan one is obvious, but many of those that were catered to minority groups, many have closed because now the bookstores are very diverse and they address all groups, which is a good thing, really. Then they go into Barnes and Noble and Amazon and how they changed the book business. Included in that, they also talk about the outdoor booksellers that were in New York City, in various boroughs of New York City, and how they'd set up their tables and sell their books, how they looked for, hunted down their books, and the life of some of these booksellers. Gosh, some of them had such a rough life. They'd sleep in their cars. But I think how quaint that is, that these were people who perhaps couldn't get a regular job. They were immigrants. And this was something that they could do. And because they created a community amongst themselves, it was the same thing happening there in those individual outdoor book tables that was happening in a bookstore with its community. And I just love the whole theme throughout this book. I'm still finishing up the last part, which is on Amazon. I have to finish this book tonight because it will go back to the library tomorrow. Hold on, I'm going to let the dog in. Okay, next book that I'm currently reading, and is 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. This is for my Historathon, and I'm doing pretty good right now. I will be starting chapter 4. I did have a setback because I think I mentioned to you in another video that I had a bad week, And sitting down was just not something I really could do. I was exceptionally uncomfortable. I spent more of my time lying down, and I can't read lying down. It's an angle. I couldn't really lie on my back to read, so it was just my reading was behind by at least a week. So unfortunately, I haven't gotten as far as I'd like to, and we're already facing the end of January. But I'll just keep going. Once I read the chapter in this book, I read the same chapter in the graphic novel. And here I am. That's my spot in the graphic novel. And it's great because it reinforces what I've read in the book itself. And I love how it's re explained in the graphic novel itself. It's really neat. And it's interesting, one of the interesting bits of information it's talking about, they mentioned that there was international trade between Egypt and the Middle East, as well as the Greek islands. A lot of people didn't realize this was the case. Now we know it is. And they also mentioned that Troy could very well have been, it probably wasn't the romantic situation that is personified in the epic poem, but they mentioned that it was the Mycenaeans, but the issue wasn't Helen of Troy, but some other matter. And they're getting into more detail about that. I think that was like, wow, I never heard that angle. I thought it was very good. The next one that I'm reading is in a library find, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, The Shallows. Great. Wonderful. I find myself just really getting into this book, and just time just goes away for me. Why this book? I don't know. Maybe because it's talking about us being focused. I'm super focused on this book. And it starts with what the initial distractions were for our civilization. So they talked about the radio, and then they talked about the radio. After the radio came, I think they were mentioning some music. Then they went into the TV sets, and that was going to destroy our nation. So they talked about how this progression of technology was taking bites out of our attention spans. But what was interesting about that is that they mention the current technology has advanced by leaps and bounds. The speed has been unprecedented. So we haven't quite caught up with what the effects have been. I mean, even now, we're just noticing that some schools are saying, all right, that's it. Cell phones in the locker for the day. Maybe they'll think of something for college where they say, no, laptops closed, in your backpack, phones in your backpack, because they're realizing that as long as you've got that machine on, the teacher doesn't have your attention, right? I hope they do that for colleges. I know we're dealing with adults, but I think that's something that needs to happen. But going back to this, it's talking about that gradual progression of technology and how it was affecting our attention spans, but not only that, but how we perceived the world around us. It went through the filter of whatever technology was happening at the time. So right now we're at the TV generation, and how it changed the way we viewed the world, processed that information, and then came to our own conclusions. Something I guess we don't think about because I grew up with television, right? My dad grew up with radio, and later television came into the picture. And I'll never forget, at least when it came to his imagination, he said that he used to listen to the Lone Ranger on the radio. And when TV entered the picture and he saw the first Lone Ranger TV show, he said he was so disappointed because it was nothing like what he had imagined. If you really think about that a lot, one thing was given up for another. I think the imagination was the better thing, and that was lost for those who never listened to an episode, whether it was Lone Ranger or something else, and those who only saw the images that were created for them. Same concept, but modernize it now to modern day technology and what it's doing for us. So this is a fascinating read, The Shallows, and this is by Nicholas Carr. The next one that I'm reading is by Anselm of Canterbury, Cur Deus Homo. And this talks about, it's a theological text. This is definitely a slow read. The process that I'm doing with this is not something you can race through, because it talks about basic concepts of sin and forgiveness, and Christ coming in the form of man, and he was actually God, and why would God do that? Why does he need to do that? It goes into all these questions and answers. It's set up in a dialogue format many times, like what you would read from Plato's writings when he would write of Socrates' dialogues with other people. Same thing is happening here. And because it's a deeper read, what I have to do is in the morning after I've had my coffee, I read a chapter or two, depending on their length and the content, and then I put it down. The next day, I read the same chapter or two again, now with fresh eyes. I've had time to sort of let it simmer, marinate, whatever, and then I'm able to highlight and put my annotations in there, just sort of my own thoughts and arguments and everything against that. This has been a really, I didn't anticipate doing that with this book. So I think that this outcome has been good. I like this. I'm working my way through a book. I'm really experiencing this book, unlike when I would read, something else that's simply, let's say, fiction or narrative fiction or something like that. It's a whole different reading experience. And because it's short, I'm willing to spend the time on doing something like this. I think after this, there's something by Aquinas I'm going to read. So we'll see how that goes. It's a little more involved. So this is the other one that I'm reading. And that's it. That's what I am reading for the week. And I ended up getting a book recently. I'll show it to you later, but it's one of those side reads that I kind of thought, ooh, I've got to read this one. Let's see if I can squeeze that into my schedule. But that is what I'm reading this week, everybody. I'm so curious to watch everybody else's videos to see what you're reading and what your thoughts are on that. Thanks for hanging out with me. Don't forget to press that like and subscribe button, and I will see all of you in just a few days. Bye-bye.